25. Pickle. We really are in one now. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the process of pickling and just what pickle is. You'll also find out about the 3 distinct pickle camps, and that they all show up on the shores of colonial North America. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. Yes, I did mention pickles back in my general vegetable episode, which, upon further reflection, I now realize should have been called something like Brassicas and Friends, or 17th century civilized English people don't let other 17th century civilized English people eat anything crunchy. Anyway, it's time for another short jaunt back into the mists of food history and the Fertile Crescent. I'll cover the etymology of the word pickle first, and then get at the how of pickles next. And finally, I'll get to the somewhat deteriorated state of pickles that made it to the 17th century British colonies and how that helped get us to where we are today, a nation with both limited pickle types and times we consume them, while most of the rest of the world has pickle variety and lots of chances to eat them. As we go into yet another fermentation episode, there's an important thing I want to make explicit. Food preservation in the pre-refrigeration age depended heavily on fermentation, and fermentation is, in reality, selectively controlled rot. Fermentation has come up so far in beer and dairy, in venison, and a little in salt. Pickling is just another example, and it will keep coming up in tea, vinegar, spices, ketchup, chocolate. I felt the need to do so since our modern age obsesses about freshness and what people insist on calling clean or unprocessed food. Yet we are absolutely enthralled to and benefit from fermented foods. If we can understand the why and how of fermentation and lose some of the fear by understanding what is beneficial rot and what is harmful rot, and that we've been cultivating a careful relationship with rot for millennia, but it needs skill, attention, and understanding, we'll be in a much better place with our food systems. Incidentally, much of the American fear or misunderstanding of fermented foods is tied to the end of the 19th century and the rise of the refrigerator in the early 20th, along with some really bad science and some pretty ugly and very slanted anti-foreigner sentiment. It's a great bunch of stories, and I'll eventually get to them all. So, word origins. The English word pickle comes from the same root that shows up in both German and Dutch languages that sounds pretty much like pickle, and specifically means to soak something in a strong brine or salty solution to preserve it. So unlike so many words in the 21st century where there's a noun which, in the words of Calvin and Hobbes, gets verbed, as in, I'm totally going to social media this burger. The word pickle was a process, a verb that got nouned. So the pickled cucumber became a pickle. And no matter where I look, anything that is called pickle does require brine, or at the very least, a large amount of salt. Because the key to pickling is breaking down cellular structure enough to allow the preservative salty acid solution in everywhere, but to also have that breakdown stopped by the same salty acid solution. When the cellular breakdown and the preservation by the salty acid solution hits a stable equilibrium, the pickle is considered done. The cellular breakdown is accomplished by a combination of the presence of lots of salt and then some bacterial action or cooking action, or a little bit of both. Once this equilibrium is reached, the pickle will remain as it is, often for a year or two, or, in the age of refrigeration, even longer. There's the issue of aging, but that's a different process, and I'll cover it more when I'm talking about things like vinegar, ham, and rum. Over time, a few different ways of pickling have developed. The most recent one is where the majority of acid in the salty acid solution is from an added or adjunct acid. rather than only waiting for fermentation to provide acid. And there are pickles that also employ oil to exclude air as a way to regulate fermentation activity. But regardless, all pickles require salt. It's a little messy, but don't worry too much about it. Really, pickle is just a convenient term we use. So where are the origins of the pickle? Follow me back to the Fertile Crescent once again. The region of Mesopotamia is the first place we have good records of people farming enough to have significant surpluses, and they start needing ways to keep the surpluses edible for later. Beer was pretty useful with the grain. The alcohol preserved the grain calories for later consumption. Yogurt and cheeses were ways of rotting dairy products selectively so they would keep for later. But what to do with the wet carbohydrates, the fruits and vegetables? Dehydration was one option, but hard to do in a humid river valley. And dried food is always in danger of rotting inconsistently when it gets wet again. And in the ages before Ziploc bags and Tupperware, that was pretty much a constant problem. So what to do with the extra produce? It turns out treating fruits and vegetables with salts slows down the rotting. Fewer microbes can live in a salty solution. And then allowing select microbes to munch away on just enough of the carbs to produce acid. And then, ta-da! The salt and the plant matter and the microbes have produced a salty acid solution for the plant matter that almost nothing can live in. And then you have pickles. Now, it wasn't just saltwater baths and that's it. It turns out that there are other spices that we now know have various antimicrobial properties. Back before the scientific method, people were always putting their experiments in their mouths and tasting them. Okay, after the scientific method as well. The Gastropod podcast has a few episodes that involve chemists licking the science. As a former chemistry teacher, please don't lick the science. I mean, in kitchen experiments, yes, that's different. You're working with food. But back to our early cooks. In the days before refrigeration, or even cellars or spring houses, it was noticed that some foods went less bad, or went bad more slowly, when they included certain plant parts. And some of those plant parts also made the food tastier, along with slowing down the rot. And some of those plant parts that have stayed with us include mustard seeds, garlic bulbs, onion seeds, grapevine leaves, dill fronds and seeds, black pepper seeds, cumin seeds, rosemary leaves, ginger roots, fennel seeds, coriander seeds, bay leaves, clove flowers, oregano leaves, thyme leaves, and cinnamon bark. If you walk through the fancy pickle section of a farmer's market, you'll likely see each and every one of these herbs and spices. And if you don't see the things we sort of now consider like sweet spices, say cinnamon, clove, fennel, or ginger, look at the pickle section of an Indian grocery. And there they are. Over time, though salt was recognized as the main player, some of the above spices also became an essential part of the process. Pickling spices have become mainly flavoring agents in our age of refrigeration and central heating. That is, I wouldn't leave a bottle of, say, Vlasics or kosher half sours out on my kitchen counter for weeks on end. But other global pickling traditions that don't depend on refrigeration the way American pickling does, they tend to have much heavier use of preservative spices like chili, mustard, garlic, and cloves in their pickles. A convenient way to access pickles that lean into all of these spices is to check out South Asian pickles. The variety of spicy, sour, salty achars is impressively long. In the 21st century U.S., green mangoes are likely the best known, but there's also limes, which is one of my favorites, carrots, chickpeas, tomatoes, ginger, cabbage, cauliflower, garlic, cucumbers, drumstick vegetable, bamboo shoots, chilies, banana flowers, orange peel, lotus roots, turnips, eggplant, and more. And it's not just produce that gets pickled. In with the vegetables, you can find prawns, fish, and pork. And there are even some regional variations of pickled bean curd or tofu. If you're curious, check out the Indian food section of a large grocery store or find a South Asian grocery in your area. It can be a fun adventure. One of the main uses of the achar pickles is to accompany what can be otherwise rather bland staple foods, lentil and bean dals, and flatbreads. Trying out a green mango or lime mixed vegetable achar with lentils and flatbread isn't just food tourism across space, it's also a bit of time travel. This is how medieval pickles were used throughout Europe. The peasant living on a largely meatless diet also livened up otherwise boring grain and bean pottages and even the occasional unseasoned meat and turnip stew with a variety of pickles. Not to mention the pickled fish. Oh, wait, I did mention the pickled fish back in episode 8. So, from Asia to Europe, ancient Rome to the Persian Golden Age, the emperors of China and the court of Queen Elizabeth, the impressive dining styles of all these courts of influence and fashion depended on carefully kept and jealously crafted pickles to liven up an eating board that could quickly become repetitive or monotonous, where being able to overwhelm one's guests with variety was an essential element of using hospitality as a way of displaying strength through plenty. Having 4 or 5 or 20 pickles on hand to impress the neighbors or the visiting diplomats was a way to keep ahead in the scoring. I mean, while for many in the 21st century, pickle may have dwindled to just a bunch of salty cucumbers, it hasn't been that way for long, even in America. The number and variety of relish dishes my grandmother had still astonishes me. Even for her, having a variety of pickled or at least salty canned vegetable concoctions on hand was an important thing. Okay, it's been established that pickles were and still are important. But what was the 17th century British scene like? What were the colonists who were entering North America bringing with them from their northern European starting points? Most of the 17th century colonists were coming from northerly starting points that didn't have the produce bonanza South and Central Asia had, but they still had a pretty good variety of fruits and vegetables. And by the 17th century, vinegar was a well-established industry. There'll be a whole episode talking about 17th century British vinegar, so for now I'll just say vinegar was plentiful. Because early colonization in the British Atlantic was initially supplied by British ship stores, happened in warm places and in cold places, and was done by groups of mostly men with no skilled cooks in some places, and with skilled cooks in other places, 3 distinct types of pickling took root in the 17th century colonies. The first was the salt-only method, which is the simplest but harshest and least tasty. The self-fermentation method, which is the tastiest but requires the most skill, and the cook and add vinegar method, which is generally a cold weather and semi-industrial method. So what's the difference? And can you taste it? Well, you can certainly taste the salt-only method. In the 17th century, since the word pickle was still right next to its briny roots, simply salting meats for preservation, when they were to be barreled and not dried, was called pickling. Thus, pickled herring, pickled cod, pickled pork fat, and even now, pickled pig's feet. For meat pickled in salt, the plan was always to soak and rinse the salt out of the food, and the hope was that the food would be little changed by the experience. As I've discussed, a few foods would take to this fairly well, but most food, and as many a sailor would point out, particularly not beef. And it's a method that has been largely abandoned. Self-fermentation pickling can only be done on plant matter. Instead of just salt drawing out liquids from the cells and creating a punishingly salty brine, microbes get involved with the plants. The dominant bacteria eat sugars from the plant matter, whether it's a fruit or a vegetable, which softens the plant texture somewhat and directly produces lactic acid. This is why self-fermented pickling is now sometimes called lactofermentation. Incidentally, this is the same acid produced in self-fermented dairy, like yogurt and cheese. But different microbes are at work because dairy sugars and plant sugars are different. Lacto-fermented pickles tend to continue to sort of low-key ferment because even at the elevated acid levels, there are still a few bacteria doing their thing. That means these pickles can sometimes have a fizzy taste to them. To simplify shipping, some store-bought lacto-fermented pickles are now pasteurized. That is, the bacteria are killed off by heat treating them. This also makes them sterile and shelf-stable as long as they remain closed. But if you purchase fresh pickles from a refrigerated section, ones that are marked as unpasteurized, they might contain warnings to not close them too tightly or leave them too long. They're still going, and you may see bubbles or taste a bit of fizz. And that's fine. That's just the carefully cultivated bacteria still working away. Vinegar pickles, on the other hand, are made by using heat to break down the plant matter instead of the microbes. The cooked vegetable matter is placed in brine with an acid from an outside source, which is typically vinegar or acetic acid, and is the result of a different set of microbes breaking down ethanol alcohol into acetic acid. These pickled vegetables have to be heated in order for this process to work, so they're often softer and less crunchy than the lacto-fermented pickled vegetables. Because there was no active fermentation going on in the 17th century vinegar pickles, in order for them to have the same shelf life as self-fermenting pickles, the salt and vinegar concentrations were often unpalatably strong. An active microbe colony doesn't mean a pickle was infection-proof, but it definitely reduced the probability that the wrong bacteria or yeast or whatever could move in and take over. Because lactic acid and acetic acid are different acids, they definitely have different tastes. Most people feel that acetic acid has a more recognizably sour flavor, but not as sour as ascorbic acid. That's the one responsible for the sour in citrus fruit and is recognized as good old vitamin C. The salt-only method by the 17th century was recognized as how to preserve meats without drying them out too much. It worked in that it kept the items from rotting, but except for a very few items, when it came to flavor and texture, it was more of a rough and ready method that left most meats the worse for wear. The self-fermentation method required the most skill. Cleanliness and caring about temperature and salt levels were essential for success. These ferments also required tending and a favorable environment for success. As you may have guessed, this was the kind of pickle that traveled with the colonists that were skilled cooks themselves or brought them along, and ended up in areas where there were weather conditions that favored fermentation, which means the middle and the southern colonies, where warmer weather lasted longer, and where German colonists arrived, because German colonists tended to arrive as families from farms. They were also more likely to bring along spices to grow in their gardens, especially dill, caraway, and coriander to add to mustard, which just grows absolutely everywhere. The vinegar method can be done a lot faster and in larger bulk quantities. And in places where cold weather is common, it can be handled with a lot less fuss than the temperature-fussy self-fermentation method. That meant vinegar pickles were more common in New England and in colonies where men far outnumbered women. That is, early Jamestown and much of Virginia. Because vinegar pickles tended to happen in these circumstances, they typically included fewer or even no spices at all. In these places, pickles were a necessary afterthought, not really a craft, and certainly were never considered a food type to be cultivated and elevated and expanded. The fact that lactofermentation, or self-fermentation, and vinegar pickling both produced a sour pickle in two different ways, one cooked and one not cooked, created some interesting problems before things like scurvy and vitamins were isolated and understood. Lacto-fermented vegetables, like the famous German sauerkraut, because they happen at controlled lower temperatures, still contain vitamin C. So sauerkraut produced that way is an effective preventative against scurvy, and some English ship captains promoted sauerkraut among their sailors. However, lactofermentation requires skill, cleanliness, and time. So some British ship victuallers, as the age of sail really got rolling, were simply cooking cabbage and dousing it with vinegar to pickle it, and calling that sauerkraut, despite the fact it was so much faster, required far less skill, and the heat-sensitive vitamin C had been cooked out. And the English tendency in the 17th century was to really, really, really cook things when they cooked them. Say, boil green beans or fish for an hour or 3. So the cooked vinegar-doused sauerkraut was useless against scurvy, even though it was also sour, which led to serious confusion over whether sauerkraut could fight scurvy or not, all the way into the 20th century. But now you know cooked sauerkraut won't protect against scurvy, but unheat-treated lacto-fermented sauerkraut will. And you know why. But what about the cucumber? How did that become the pickle? Well, when the 17th century colonists were headed to the New World, they were bringing a whole slew of vegetables, and then either cooked them in added vinegar or let them self-ferment, depending on the weather, the equipment, the ingredients, and the skill. Cucumbers were definitely included, but so were cauliflowers, radishes, asparagus, beans, beets, onions, along with fruits and even some nuts, especially green or underripe ones. Underripe plums, green walnuts, quinces, pears, apples, berries, nasturtium seed pods, peaches, all of those. In the age before sugar, salt was the way to preserve the extra produce, so pickling was simply for everything you didn't eat, couldn't dry, and didn't turn into beer, which meant in the 17th century there was much more variety in what was being pickled than we have now, but largely due to necessity. Because most of the pickling done in the 17th century colonies was being done by city people or back in England by bulk ship suppliers, the use of herbs and spices, which again requires skill and costs more, alongside with the critical salt and vinegar, a lot of those spices simply fell out of general usage, which tended to make not so tasty pickles. So as other ways to preserve food rose, pickling became a neglected art in much of colonial America. Well, outside of any areas settled by Germans and later Eastern Europeans. Pickling would revive and expand in the 19th and 20th centuries, but that is when the cucumber really became the only pickle in America. But for now, we'll just have to wait for that story. Because in the 17th century, pickle was a process. Pickled is a pickled thing. There's pickled herring, pickled beets, pickled beans, pickled peaches, pickled shrimp, pickled pork, pickled watermelon rind, and even pickled cucumbers. But if you just said pickle, it would be assumed that you were talking about a bath of salty water. In fact, recipes of the time talk about adding salt or vinegar or mustard seeds to a pickle. And they specifically meant the solution for pickling something. But beyond the poor quality and the underspiced nature of pickled foods that most 17th century colonists experienced, the other thing that caused pickling to fall out of favor in the British colonies was the fact that pickles are heavy and don't travel well. They're wet, and they do best in heavy pottery jars or barrels. They like to stay put in dark places, not move around, and they prefer to avoid temperature fluctuations, even the vinegar ones. That required the building of things like cellars and staying in one place for a long time, and neither of these things was particularly popular among many of the earliest colonists, except for the very wealthiest who had good cellars, skilled cooks, and would purchase good spices for their pickles. Most early colonists tended not to build homes that supported pickling infrastructure, or they were indentured servants who didn't even have their own homes. And most families, again, aside from the very rich, had only a limited number of crocks and barrels and jars, and frankly were not of a mindset to start building up stocks of food that required fussing about with, and the purchase of expensive spices to improve. Unlike many of the other foods and food-associated products that were a part of colonial life, there was nothing about a pickle that was useful for making money by selling something back to Europe. And as a result, pickles and pickling hung around as necessities, but were never loved and developed the way other things like cod or wheat or beef were. So pickles were definitely important and did play a role in 17th century colonial food, but not an exciting one, and certainly not one that was well loved or celebrated. So for the next 150 to 200 years or so, in the mainstream of American food, pickles are going to get short shrift. They're just salty food that has to be soaked or rinsed to be any good at all. There was one pickled product that was sold back to Europe, and that was pickled pork. Because raising a colonial pig was far cheaper than raising a British or even European pig. But hands down, the trickiest part of that equation was catching the colonial pig so it could be butchered and barreled. Which means you can join me next week to listen to tales about the terrifying swine of the 17th century. And there will be a little glimpse at how the distant offspring of those colonial pigs that ravaged Native American gardens are now making life difficult for the modern American farmer. Does that mean there are karma pigs? Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. You can reach me on Twitter at THOAFood, or if email is more of your thing, questions or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. A few words to review this podcast really do make a difference. Reviews can be easily left at Good Pods and help me make sure I'm heading in an interesting direction. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. Link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio at THOAFood and in the show description.